Welcome to Your Fresh Trails. Today our topic is history. Continuing the history of Brazil, we are going to talk about the mining period and the treaties. Join us to learn more. All right, let's take a look at our roadmap for today's explainer. First, the mining period boom. Second, Pombal's Enlightenment era. Third, Gusmão's masterful treaty. Fourth, the Boundary Treaty roller coaster. And finally, Brazil's lasting legacy. Section 1. The mining period boom, a sudden windfall. Imagine your family has been quietly farming for generations, just barely making ends meet, right? And then, suddenly, boom, you win the biggest lottery in history. That is exactly what happened to Portugal when gold was discovered in the Brazilian interior in the late 1600s. But just like winning the lottery, it brought absolute chaos. Why? Well, it all goes back to an arbitrary line drawn in 1494. With the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Pope basically drew a straight vertical line down a blank map. Portugal gets the east, Spain gets the west. This one line divided the entire globe, dictating global destinies, which, by the way, explains why South America speaks mostly Spanish and Portuguese, and why archipelagos on the complete opposite side of the Pacific, like the Philippines, ultimately fell under Spanish rule. But out in the wild, straight lines just don't exist. When Portuguese colonists started finding gold, they completely ignored that old imaginary line and kept pushing deep into Spanish-claimed territory. Now, this massive, rapid expansion created what observers at the time called a spider economy. Picture this, a spider with a giant, heavy head representing the capital city of Lisbon, hoarding all the wealth, but with incredibly long, thin, and very fragile legs reaching all the way across the Atlantic and deep into the South American interior. The empire was physically overextended. Because those legs were so weak, the government couldn't properly patrol the mining areas. Smuggling quickly became a massive underground industry. Gold was literally slipping through the cracks, traded illegally with neighboring Spanish colonies for silver, completely bypassing Portuguese tax collectors. The central office was losing control of its far-flung branches. Section 2. Pombal's Enlightenment era, the strict manager. So how do you fix a chaotic, overgrown family business? Well, you bring in a strict, no-nonsense manager. Enter Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal. When King Joseph I took the throne in 1750, Pombal essentially took over the state's management to audit the entire empire. His governing style can be summed up in this Portuguese term, despotism esclarecido, or enlightened despotism in English. This wasn't just some tyrant throwing his weight around. This was absolute rule driven by the modern, rational, scientific principles of the Enlightenment. Pombal wanted to inject strict administrative logic into the Portuguese empire to cut through all the inefficiency, modernize public management, maximize profits, and ultimately secure the borders. To stop the tax evasion happening in the gold mines, Pombal's administration established a guaranteed minimum quota of gold that the colony had to send back to the crown every single year. If the region failed to meet that quota, the government enforced the derrama. Basically, this was an aggressive, mandatory per capita tax audit where authorities would confiscate personal property from the colonists to make up the exact difference. Think of it like your neighborhood homeowners association violently enforcing a massive special assessment fee just because someone didn't pay their dues. It was highly effective for the state's bottom line, for sure, but it was deeply resented by the people on the ground. Pombal quickly laid down his strict house rules. He established rigid trade monopolies and reformed taxation. But perhaps his boldest move was expelling the Jesuit missionary order in 1759. At the time, you have to understand, the Jesuits operated almost like an independent rival megacorporation. They controlled massive amounts of land and indigenous labor. Pombal wanted a total monopoly on power, so he dismantled the church's competing corporate influence to consolidate secular state control. It was a massive geopolitical shockwave, honestly, and it actually mirrored Spain's own expulsion of the Jesuits from its global colonies, including places like the Philippines, just a few years later. Section 3. Gusmão's masterful treaty, redrawing the fences. While Pombal secured the finances, Portugal still had a major real estate problem on its hands. They had built this massive gold mining operation on land that technically belonged to Spain. They needed a brilliant lawyer to redraw the neighborhood fences. That lawyer was Alexandre de Gusmão. Born in Brazil, he understood the reality on the ground way better than any bureaucrat sitting in Europe. His absolute genius was reviving an old Roman legal principle, uti possidetis, which translates to as you possess. In everyday terms, this is basically squatters' rights. Guzman brilliantly argued that whoever actually occupies the land, builds on it, and works it, whoever mows the lawn, so to speak, should legally own it. Since Portuguese miners and explorers were the ones physically living in the vast interior, Guzman argued the land legally belonged to Portugal. This created a completely new way of looking at maps. The old way relied on arbitrary, straight lines drawn across a blank map by monarchs who had never even seen the continent. It was literally like drawing a fence right through the middle of someone's living room without checking the floor plan. But Guzman championed using natural borders. He argued that geopolitical boundaries should follow the actual, visible geography of the land, the rivers, the mountain ranges, the watersheds, based on the physical occupation of the people actually living there. It was practical, it was highly visual, and it made perfect sense for a rapidly expanding empire. Section 4. The Boundary Treaty Roller Coaster. Decades of Dispute. Agreeing on these new fence lines, yeah, it was anything but smooth. It was a completely chaotic sequence. It starts with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. But the real breakthrough was Guzman's masterpiece, the Treaty of Madrid in 1750, which officially adopted that uti possidetis principle we talked about. But remember, in this era, colonial territories across the entire globe were used as bargaining chips by European monarchs. Treaties were signed, annulled, and redrawn in a dizzying tug-of-war. For context, this was around the time of the 7 Years' War, which even resulted in the brief British occupation of Manila, showing just how fluid and globally connected these imperial borders really were. In South America, this geopolitical roller coaster led to the Treaty of El Pardo, the Treaty of Santo Ildefonso, and finally the Treaty of Badajoz in 1801. The biggest sticking points of this whole roller coaster were down south, near the Rio de la Plata. In the 1750 Treaty of Madrid, Portugal agreed to a massive property swap. They gave up the smuggling hub of the Sacramento colony to Spain in exchange for the incredibly rich agricultural lands of the Seven Missions. It was a very pragmatic trade. But colonial politics shifted, and by the 1777 Treaty of Santo Ildefonso, a weakened Portugal lost out terribly. Spain basically took back the Seven Missions and kept Sacramento. However, despite these painful southern losses, the vast Amazon and Central Western territories secured by the Treaty of Madrid remained largely in Portuguese hands. The core shape of the map had been forged. Section 5. Brazil's Lasting Legacy, a map forged in gold and diplomacy. When you look at a map of South America today, that massive footprint of Brazil is absolutely no accident. It is the direct result of those early explorers chasing the lottery of gold deep into the jungle, combined with a brilliant legal defense. Just looking back at our timeline, 1713 gave us the early definitions at Utrecht. The truly pivotal year was 1750, when the Treaty of Madrid established borders based on actual occupation, right as the Marquis of Pombal rose to power. By 1759, Pombal expelled the Jesuits for absolute state control. The roller coaster continued through Santo Ildefonso in 1777 and Badajoz in 1801. Together, this sequence completely dismantled the old arbitrary lines of the world. While Pombal enforced the strict internal management, Guzman built the diplomatic shield that protected massive territorial gains, actively constructing the geographic reality of Brazil we recognize today. Brazilian history has events that show how the search for gold and the drive to occupy the interior pushed our borders far beyond what any initial treaty could have predicted. And what about you? Which of these twists in the dispute over our lands and riches did you find most surprising? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and send this explainer to anyone who might need it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.